What is up, guys? This is Weasel for PokerWeasel.com. Today we're going to be talking about semi-bluffing. So, what can we expect in this episode? We're going to start off with a definition of semi-bluffing, really basic stuff. What is a semi-bluff? We're going to then start looking at the expectation of various semi-bluffs and consider which variables impact on our expected value. We're going to talk about the true break-even point of a semi-bluff. Now, you're probably familiar with break-even points, but we're talking about something slightly different here, which is the effective break-even point of a semi-bluff. If this is not something you've ever thought about, or you don't know what we're talking about, don't worry, we're going to explain it when we get there. We're also going to have a look at the impact of implied odds on semi-bluff expectation. Now, this is something that you will rarely hear anyone ever talk about. Usually when players are calculating the expectation of a semi-bluff, they purely look at the street they're on in an attempt to determine their expectation. But in order to fully relate to the profitability of a semi-bluff, we need to be aware of variables on later streets which can impact on our expectation. One of the reasons why players maybe don't consider what can happen on later streets is that when we first start thinking about implied odds, we generally take a very basic situation. For example, we might look at a turn scenario where we shove all in with a flush draw. We know that there's going to be zero river play in that situation because we are already all in. Either our opponent folds or he calls, and then we know exactly what our expectation is after our opponent calls because everyone is all in, we're guaranteed to see a showdown. But what about situations where we're not all in and there is potentially going to be some play on the river? This is going to impact on the expectation of the semi-bluff itself and may influence whether we decide to actually semi-bluff based on the break-even point of our semi-bluff, the true or effective break-even point. So don't worry if this sounds confusing. Let's start at the basics, which is the definition of semi-bluff. So far, we've looked at value betting, we've looked at bluffing. Hopefully these made sense. I would imagine 95% of watchers already know exactly what a value bet and a bluff and a semi-bluff is, but let's define our term. In some ways, you could think of a semi-bluff as a cross between a value bet and a bluff, but essentially a semi-bluff is a type of bluff. It's one where we have a significant pot equity factor. For example, we're bluffing on the turn, but we have a flush draw as well. What that means is our bluff doesn't actually need to work at the break-even point, the one we defined in the previous video, where we had a look at the percentage of the total pot we are investing. So to give an example, let's say we bet 2/3 pot. Hopefully we already know that a 2/3 pot bluff needs to succeed above about 40% of the time to be directly profitable. But assuming we have something like a flush draw, which means even when our bluff fails, we can sometimes go on to win the pot based on our pot equity. It means our bluff no longer needs to work 40% of the time. In fact, our bluff can work considerably less of the time given that we have some pot equity. Now, this is not what we mean by effective break-even point, although it is a type of effective break-even point. The break-even point of our bluff is effectively lowered because we have pot equity. Now, many of the bluffs we make on earlier streets are technically semi-bluffs. For example, even if we fire a continuation bet on the flop with garbage, which is not generally something we should do, but let's imagine we do that, we might think of it as a zero equity bluff, but we often have a pot equity component. Perhaps we have something like an overcard against some of the holdings in our opponent's range. And while that might not give us a huge amount of equity, it does give us some equity. We'll often still refer to these scenarios as bluffs, but the truth is that a bet on any street before the river is usually actually a semi-bluff. There's some crossover here in the way that we use linguistics. Any bluff on flop and turn is ultimately a semi-bluff unless we know for certain that we're drawing dead, then we can call it a bluff. But generally speaking, any trashy hand which we semi-bluff with, we're going to refer to that as a bluff most of the time. There's nothing mathematical about this. This is just how poker players use linguistics. And as we're going to go on to see in the next part of the series, that linguistics is not really that important. In fact, if we want to use a linguistic-based approach to solving poker, we're generally going to find that's flawed. We just need to understand that some of the situations referred to as bluffs are actually semi-bluffs. For the most part, when someone is talking about semi-bluffing, they're talking about a bet on the flop or turn, and they are specifically holding a gut shot or better. At least this is how semi-bluff is most commonly used. It might be the case that someone refers to a backdoor flush draw on the flop as a semi-bluff. They might refer to it as a bluff. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter too much. We're mostly interested in the mathematical expectation. We don't really care what people call certain types of bets, but just so we can be maybe involved with the community and understand other poker players when they start talking about these things. That's the rough idea of the difference between a bluff and a semi-bluff. In other words, it's kind of hazy actually, and really depends on the player's perception who is making the bet. Now, in terms of expectation, these are the standard variables which influence the expectation of a semi-bluff, our fold equity, and our pot equity. Now, it's reasonably straightforward. The more fold equity or pot equity we have, the more profitable the bet. And there are different breeds of semi-bluffs. We get some semi-bluffs which have a ton of pot equity but maybe don't have that much fold equity. We get other semi-bluffs which have a ton of fold equity, maybe even to the point where they are actually already breaking even in terms of a zero pot equity bluff, but the fact that they have that pot equity component on top of the fold equity just makes them even more profitable. So we get some semi-bluffs with a bunch of fold equity and a small amount of pot equity. We of course get situations where we have an average amount of fold equity or pot equity. You get the idea. There can be different levels of fold equity or pot equity in a semi-bluff, but the basic idea is the more we have of both of these, the more profitable the overall expectation is going to be. We're going to demonstrate this very shortly using Card Runners EV. So in terms of linguistics, when we talk about semi-bluffs, we are mainly looking for folds. We don't expect to have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. Now, in some cases we might, and once again we really start to touch on these hazy borders between our linguistic definitions of various bets. For example, it's actually conceivable that we make a semi-bluff and we end up having over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range. We just won't generally refer to this as a semi-bluff. We might refer to it as a thin value bet, or we might refer to it as a protection bet. That's something we're going to talk about later in the series. But just because we have over 50% equity against our opponent's calling range doesn't mean that we don't value the fold equity we get when we bet. You can see we're really going down the rabbit hole right now. We're going to talk about this more when we get to the video on protection betting. But right now we're just going to keep it straightforward and focus on the variables which impact on the expectation of semi-bluffing. So let's start with the absolute basics. We're going to look at a very basic semi-bluff situation in Card Runners EV, the kind of simple ones that we mentioned people generally start off with when we're talking about the topic of semi-bluffing and its associated expectation. In other words, we're going to look at a turn situation and we're just going to ignore anything that happens on the river to keep things very, very simple. Of course, the easiest way of doing that is to assume that we are all in on the turn, therefore nothing can happen on the river. We can simply have some stacks remaining for the river, but for some reason we sign an agreement with our opponent where we say the river always goes check, check. Same kind of thing, really. So let's review what we're looking at in this situation. Firstly, let's imagine that we are on the button, we're in position on the turn, and we have a flush draw. We have ace-5 of diamonds. You can see the board texture here at the top, king, 7-2, 6 of diamonds, so we pick up a flush draw on the turn. We're thinking about semi-bluffing the turn in position after our opponent checks to us. Now, our opponent's range is not really that important. We don't need his range to be realistic. We just want to have a look at how his defending frequencies will impact on our expectation. So we've given him a range here. I'll show you anyway, but it really doesn't matter too much. I've given him a selection of some top pair hands, some ace-high hands, and even a 7x hand there, but this really doesn't matter too much. We're mainly just interested in influencing the frequency with which he defends. So what we did, for example, is currently after we bet the button for 10.67 chips, so about 2/3 pot, and there's about 16 in the middle on the turn, And we've given our opponent the instruction to defend anything that's top pair or better, and that's given him a defending frequency of about 60% and a folding frequency of about 40%. That's what we're mainly interested in. We don't care at this stage whether his folding or calling range is realistic. We don't need that in order to compute our expectation. The main thing we're interested in for the most part is that the majority of hands in our opponent's assigned range beat us. In fact, I think they all beat us. And so unless we improve on some rivers, now we assigned a blank river here, which means we could actually spike our ace and be good against our opponent's king x, so we have a little bit of extra equity there. But Carduran's EV is going to take care of all of this for us. Now notice here on the river, we've given the option to check down, which means we've agreed that on the river we're always going to check down against our opponent and fully realize equity against each other. Now, of course, this could be the same as saying that we're all in on the turn. So the 16 in the middle of the turn, we bet 1067, and that's our last 1067. We're all in. It's going to be the same expectation in this case. Now, one final thing to note, which hopefully you recall from the earlier experiments with Carduran's EV, is what is 0 EV relative to how much we've invested already? So what do we mean by this exactly? Well, there's 16 in the middle on the turn, and notice we've started this EV calculation for the turn. We haven't started it from pre-flop, which means that we've probably invested about 8 big blinds of that. Let's call it 8 big blinds. Might not be exactly 8 big blinds, but for simplicity's sake, let's say it's 8 big blinds. So if we have an expectation of 8 big blinds at some point on the turn, it basically means we're breaking even for the entire hand. If we have an expectation of less than 8 big blinds, it means we're making money relative to our current decision, i.e. it's above 0 EV, but we're actually losing money for the overall hand. So let's have a look at our expectations and put that into context. So big blind checks, we decide to semi-bluff with our flush draw. He's folding 40% of the time, which by the way is roughly going to be the break-even threshold for a 2/3 pot bet. That's why we set up the example this way. What we know, therefore, is that if we're roughly breaking even with 0 equity and we have a flush draw, then this is definitely going to be a profitable semi-bluff. So let's have a look at the expectation. Well, we're interested in the expectation at the point where we bet, which is 5.95. So there's something interesting to take away from this right off the bat. Yes, it is profitable to semi-bluff, but we're still actually losing money for the overall hand. That's maybe something you might want to stop for a few seconds and try and get your head around. So it is profitable relative to folding being 0 EV, but relative to the 8 big blinds we've invested on the flop and pre-flop, we're actually making a loss for the overall hand on average. A similar situation, which is a little bit more simple to think about, which basically involves the same concept, is imagine, for example, you're out of position on the river, and you want to make a 2/3 pot bluff. You know the break-even point of that bluff is around 40, and let's say the bluff works 45%. Yes, your expectation is going to be positive when you make that bluff, but you're essentially only taking away a few big blinds from a pot where you've potentially invested maybe 50 big blinds. So your expectation for the overhand is going to be negative. Okay, now we're interested in the two variables we discussed, which were fold equity and pot equity. You can see currently our expectation is 6 big blinds, roughly 5.95. We'll just take a shot of that because I have a tendency to forget what our EV is, so we'll have a look at this later. So what we're going to do is we're going to play around with the variables we described, so we're going to increase our fold equity. Now a simple way of doing this is just telling our opponent that he needs to fold more hands. So we go to edit conditions here. We'll delete this current condition we've set up, which is that he's calling with top pair or better. And basically we're going to say that he's going to call, let's say, only with the top X% of equity, and let's say he's really tight for some unknown reason. He's only defending the top 30% of hands in this case. We're going to rerun that, and you should see, for example, the folding option gets adjusted to folding 70% or so. You can see it makes its best approximation, so he's actually calling 29.6, he's folding 17.4. Let's have a look at our EV, 10.75. Okay, we can clearly see there is a correlation between the amount of folds we get and our profitability, to the point now where if he's folding this frequently, we're actually generating profit for the overall hand, because we are coming out of the turn with an expectation of 10.75, and we've only invested 8 leading up to that point. So overall expectation there is going to be 2.7 BB for the overall hand. This is very good for us. Now let's go back and have a look at our previous situation again, and we're going to tweak the equity. In fact, we'll do the other way around here. Let's reduce our equity, since it's hard to increase our semi-bluffing equity given that we already have such a strong draw. So we can just go to edit the pre-flop ranges. Now we've given ourselves ace-5 of diamonds. Let's think of a slightly weaker draw. Okay, let's pretend we have a gut shot. Okay, let's pretend we have 10-8 offsuit and we want a semi-bluff. So we've reduced our pot equity. Let's have a look at the effect on our overall expectation. You can see our EV drops to 3.47. Just so we can double check, you see originally it was 5.95. So we can clearly see the correlation there. Okay, so here is where it starts to get slightly more complex. Misconceptions on semi-bluffing. These are things that people generally don't know about semi-bluffing, including some good players. So calculating effective break-even point of a semi-bluff. We mentioned that we are not talking about our adjusted break-even point given our equity. We're talking about finding the max EV line. I'm going to explain exactly what we mean by this. Also, most players think there's no difference between semi-bluffing in position and out of position. And while in some senses that is true, if we compare a turn jam out of position and a turn jam in position with a semi-bluff with all the other variables the same, yes, the expectation will be the same. The important thing is understanding what the effective break-even point on a semi-bluff is, assuming we're in position and out of position. In other words, to understand this, we're going to have to go through effective break-even points first, and then you'll understand the context you need for in position versus out of position semi-bluffing. Also want to talk about understanding the effect of pot building, implied odds basically, because most players look at these very, very basic semi-bluff situations. They don't get to the stage where they start considering questions as, how do my implied odds affect the profitability of my semi-bluff? Does building a pot have any inherent value, or is it just a secondary concept that can mostly be ignored? Okay, let's start with the first one, calculating effective break-even point of a bluff. Now at this point you're probably wondering exactly what I'm talking about, since I'm going on about this effective break-even point, and I'm denying that it's the same break-even point that most people are using, so let's see if we can bring some clarification to this. Now let's look at the situation, exactly the same situation as before, with semi-bluffing in position on the turn with a flush draw. What is the break-even point of this bluff? Feel free to go and calculate it. If you've got card around as EV, you can fire it up. This is also a simple enough situation where you should be able to do this by hand. Now I'm just going to guess at roughly what the break-even point of this bluff is. Let's assume our opponent is not folding very much at all, and he's actually going to defend, let's say, the top 85% of his equity. Let's see how close this gets us. I'm just going to do the EV run here. EV is still positive, notice that, 1.6. So actually, this is still profitable to bluff a semi-bluff on the turn, even if our opponent is folding 15% of the time only. So let's edit those conditions slightly. Let's say now instead of top 85, he's going to call the top 90%. So he's only going to fold 10% now. I guess this is going to take us close to the break-even point, 0.67. I mean, you can see this is kind of insane that we just hardly need our opponent to fold at all, assuming that we have a draw as strong as ace-5 of diamonds in this case. Let's try one more. Let's try the top 95%. Surely this has to start becoming minus EV at some point. That's ever so slightly negative. Now this is potentially something that you didn't realize, or in some cases it's something that you realized and put too much emphasis or weight on it. So let's start with the first of those two statements. So it's fascinating to see that we're not actually losing any money, even if we only have about 5 or 6% fold equity with a flush draw. We're breaking even. However, here is where the misconception arises. This is not the break-even point of the bluff, Or at least it's not the effective break-even point of the bluff, and there's going to be a big difference here. So stop for a minute and think about this. What is the huge underlying problem with this calculation? Why can we not just say, oh, okay, my EV is 0, that means I can just bluff here and it's going to be fine because I'm not losing money? What is the big problem? Stop and think, come up with an answer, then continue with the video. Okay, so this is the problem. In a situation where our options are to either check fold or bluff, it's fine if our expectation is 0 at that decision because there's no difference between check folding and bluffing. But here's the problem. Our decision here is not between bluffing and check folding. Our decision is between bluffing or checking back. And checking back has to carry a positive expectation. Why? Because we're basically going to be free rolling with a nut flush draw. And that's going to spike 20% of the time. In fact, given that we've got some ace-high overcards, you can see that Card Runner's EV is telling us we've got 26% equity in the spot. So what that means is, if we just check back the turn, and the river goes check-check, and again, let's make a written contract with our opponent that we're just going to check down the river. We'll come to river action shortly. We are basically entitled to roughly a quarter of that 16 big blind pot. In other words, our expectation should be at least 4 big blinds with a check. Let's see if we can demonstrate that using Card Runner's EV. So, rather than bet, we're going to delete this action for the button. We're going to tell the button to simply check, and the river's going to go check-check with all hands. Let's have a look at our expectation in this scenario. Look at that, 4.16 BB. So what is the effective break-even point on a semi-bluff in this situation, assuming river goes check-check? Hopefully you know the answer by now. The answer is 4.16. This is the break-even point on our bluff. So if we go back to our original semi-bluff now, we can calculate a better break-even point. And once again, we can roughly estimate this. Just as a recap, we saw that assuming we had 26% equity and about 40% folds, that our expectation was about 6. So that should tell us that 40% folds is clearly profitable, but once we start getting slightly lower than that, we'll estimate maybe around 30%, then checking could potentially have a higher expectation, assuming the river goes check-check, and that last part's important, as we're going to see shortly. So, let's assume that villain continues with the top 70% of equity. He folds 30% of the time. Let's analyze our expectation. You can see our expectation is around 4. This is actually going to be a slightly losing bluff. Not in the sense that it's not plus EV, and not even in the sense that, oh, okay, we've invested 8, so we're losing 4. It's going to be losing in the sense that it's not max EV. We saw that we can generate 4.16 big blinds with a check back, assuming no river action. Therefore, this is going to be losing in the sense that it's just not the highest EV option. So we have to keep that in mind when playing semi-bluffs in position. We have the option to realize a certain percentage of the pot by just checking back. So just because we can profitably bluff doesn't guarantee it's going to be the highest EV. This is very important. So hopefully you see now what I'm talking about when I say the break-even point of a bluff confuses people. And this is especially the case when we're doing it manually, we're doing the EV calculation on paper or in a notepad document, because we often might have the tendency to just analyze one scenario. Just say, okay, at what point does my semi-bluff stop being profitable? But then we don't analyze the other scenario, another option where we can generate a positive expectation. And if you don't analyze the expectation of a check here, you could be making some really bad turn decisions. However, we want to make this more applicable to our current games, because in most cases there is going to be some river action, and we want to factor that in to whether it's going to be the max EV option to semi-bluff on the turn. Before we do this, let's think about the amount of the pot we realize assuming we are out of position, because that was the second thing on our misconceptions list, the difference between semi-bluffing in position and out of position. And we mentioned that we would understand this better once we'd explained what was meant by the effective break-even point of a turn semi-bluff. So we know now that it's going to be roughly 26% of the pot when we check back, assuming we have 26% equity. It's pretty straightforward. So what happens now if we reach the turn out of position with our draw, and we have the option of checking the turn out of position or semi-bluffing? What is going to be the effective break-even point of our semi-bluff there? Well, interestingly, it's going to be a lot lower because we're not guaranteed to see a river and fully realize our equity. Our opponent can lower the expectation of our checks by betting. So in this particular tree, we've just swapped things around. So now we're out of position on the turn with ace-5 of diamonds. The board texture is roughly the same. I think it might be exactly the same. And our opponent has a similar range as well. So most of the things should be the same. They're slightly different, actually. Hopefully it shouldn't affect the relative expectation. So we're expecting our expectation to be roughly similar. Let's just run the maths here and see what our equity is. So you can see that we actually only have 25.3% equity instead of 26%. Shouldn't really make a big difference to anything in this case. We should expect that if we semi-bluff here and the river goes check-check, that everything's going to be pretty much exactly the same. In other words, if we have 26% equity and we have 40% fold equity, we're going to be generating our expectation of 5 point whatever it was, 5.95. At what point does it stop being profitable to semi-bluff out of position, though? What is the effective break-even point? Well, in order to establish that, we need to figure out what is our expectation when we check out of position, and that's going to depend. What is our expectation going to depend on? It's going to depend on how aggressively our opponent stabs in position after we check. You see, one thing that we know is if we made an agreement with our opponent that he always checks back the turn, then there's going to be no difference between our expectation when we check in position and our expectation when we check out of position, because we always get to fully realize the equity on the turn. But that's not necessarily going to happen in practice. Our opponent's going to be stabbing. And generally speaking, the more often he stabs, the lower our expectation is going to be, although that may not strictly be true, because once he starts stabbing very aggressively, we have the option to check raise. We're going to assume that we don't have the option to check raise right now, and therefore the more often he bets, the lower our expectation is going to become, because we're forced to put more money into the pot with a higher frequency, having an equity disadvantage, i.e. we're assuming he has a made hand right now, and we just have a flush draw, so he has the equity advantage. You see he has 75% equity according to Card Runner's EV. Let's start therefore with the worst case scenario. So what happens here is we decide to check our flush draw out of position on the turn instead of semi-bluffing. Probably not the right thing to do. We're doing this so we can establish the effective break-even point of our bluff. Our opponent bets 2/3 pot, 100% frequency. We call. River gets checked down as usual. You can see our expectation is actually negative in this case. We're actually losing money. However, I do think we've been kind of harsh on ourselves here. This really is the worst case scenario. But you can see that if checking really did have a negative expectation, then we should take any profitable turn semi-bluff. So the thing we can probably learn already by looking at this slightly pessimistic model is that we actually have to bluff more aggressively out of position. That's because the effective break-even point on our bluff is actually lower when we're out of position, because the associated expectation of a check is therefore lower. And if we can beat that expectation with a bluff, then we should bluff. Let's start making things a little bit less weighted against us in this case. So we've modified this tree slightly. This is what's happening. Assuming that we check call and then hit, we're going to be donk betting our flush combos. It's going to happen maybe 20% of the time. And we're going to assume that our opponent pays us off about 50% of the time. We're going to assume the rest of the time we check and he checks back. That's going to be roughly the equivalent of losing, unless maybe we spike an ace or something and he decides to check back. He may of course bluff some of the time, but we're going to assume that we're going to check fold if he bets in this case. So really, this is actually good for us that we sometimes get to free roll some equity on the river when it goes check-check, assuming maybe bink an ace or something. So this should increase our expectation. We saw that it was slightly negative before. And notice now that our expectation has been bumped up to 1.1. It's still not quite the 4 big blinds expectation or so we had by checking back in position, but we can see that it is possible to generate a positive expectation with a check. Now, of course, there's something else that's maybe a little bit unbalanced about the situation, which is apparently our opponent is stabbing 100% of the time on the turn. Let's see if we can change that slightly. So now let's assume that he checks with some frequency. So I'm just going to edit the conditions. I'm going to say he maybe bets the top 50% of equity, which means he checks the bottom 50% of equity. Now let's assume we hit a flush. In this case on the river, we're going to do everything the same, except our bet's going to be a bit smaller relative to the size of the pot. Notice that after we check call the turn, we're actually betting river for about 25 big blinds because we built the pot in the turn. Whereas in this case, the pot didn't grow on the turn, so we're just going to value bet the river. Only when we hit a flush though, we're going to assume that we don't value bet anything else. So it's going to be a very simple model. Our opponent is going to call again with the top 50% of his equity. So we're really taking a very frequency-based approach to this. We're not too concerned whether the range is accurate. Still going to give us a pretty good idea of what the expectation is. Obviously, big blind needs the option to check. We'll assume button's going to check down again. So you can see it's pretty much the same as the tree above. So exactly the same action on the river, regardless of whether our opponent bets the turn or not. Now, given that we sometimes get to see a river for free, we should see a spike in our expectation. So it was 1.1 previously. Let's run the EV calculation again, 2.79. Now, one thing to just keep in mind here is that we can't compare this to our 4.16 big blind expectation directly. Maybe you remember the reason why. Just stop and think for a minute. Maybe pause the video again. Why can we not compare this to 4.16? Here is that model again, by the way. The check down model in position. You can see our expectation is clearly 4.16 with a check. Why can we not compare these two EVs directly? Well, hopefully you've got it by now. We decided that the river was going to go check here, which is not necessarily realistic. So let's see what happens if we maybe add some action here on the river. So it goes check because we control the action, we check in position. And let's say that our opponent has a tendency to lead the river. So we're going to say that he bets the top 50% of his equity here. And we just call if we have a flush. Just want to get rid of that check down even. So he decides to bet 2/3 pot. The conditions are that he has the top 50% of his equity. Otherwise, he's going to check, like so. I guess if he checks, we're now going to fire our flush draws. So we're going to bet 2/3 when we have a flush. The rest of the time we're going to check. This guy, maybe let's say he's going to call with top 50% of equity. And then he's going to fold the rest. We're only going to bet if we have a flush, by the way. Otherwise, we're going to check. And obviously here on the river, when our opponent leads, we have the option to either call or fold. And we're going to call with a flush again. So the reason why we're choosing flush is basically saying if we hit, we're going to call. And we're not worrying too much about any extra variables like what happens if we spike an ace, are we going to call? We're just going to assume that we're going to fold. We probably would call in practice, but we just want to make a rough model here. So let's have a look at the expectation. And I just fixed the model slightly because for some reason I'd put that we bet straights, which basically had an impact on our expectation. We obviously want to bet flushes. So let's have a look at our expectation with our check back. You can see it's gone up slightly. Really hasn't gone up that much. It's gone up by a couple of big blinds now that we can make this extra money on the river. So basically now with this model, assuming we open up the possibilities of river action, which we haven't done with a semi-bluff yet, by the way. When we looked at our semi-bluffing situation, we assumed that the river was going to go check. So we're going to get back to that very shortly because we want to see the importance of building a pot. But assuming we now open the game up to river action, assuming it's not an all-in situation on the turn, or assuming we don't sign some contract where we agree to check down the river, we can see that we're generating an expectation of about 5.51 here, which is over a quarter of the pot, despite the fact we have 26% equity, and this is because we've factored in some possibilities of getting paid off on the river when we hit. So it's 5.51 in position. It was something like 2.79 out of position. Basic idea is, unless our expectation of a bluff out of position is higher than 2.79, then we don't want to be bluffing. It doesn't matter if our expectation is positive. We make a big blind by bluffing. We're not taking the max EV option. We have to beat 2.79 big blinds in expectation. In position, we have to beat 5.51. Now, the thing that I really want you to take away from this is that so far, in a situation where we don't include river play, it's pretty close. So let's say you have the option to shove the turn in position with a flush draw, and there's going to be no river action. Unless you have about 30% fold equity or more, yes, shoving will be profitable. We saw that it's profitable with even 5% fold equity, with maybe slightly losing, but even with, let's say, 10% fold equity, we're making money, but it doesn't mean it's the best thing to do, because we know that we can generate roughly a quarter of the value of the pot in expectation with a check. So what we saw is, unless we have over 30% fold equity, there is no good reason to be jamming the turn in position with a flush draw. It might be worth jamming the turn out of position, because we know the break-even threshold is going to be lower, the effective break-even point that is, but we've seen that we can still possibly generate as much as 3 big blinds with a check out of position, 2.79 or so, and therefore we definitely don't want to be jamming the turn if the expectation is only going to be marginally positive, like if we make a big blind. And once again, it's very, very easy to fall into this trap. That's why it's put down as a misconception. We simply run the maths for, is this semi-bluff profitable? Oh yeah, we make a big blind if we semi-bluff here. Great, let's semi-bluff. No, because you're not generating the maximum expectation, given that you can generate 2.79 BB as a check. Now the thing that I want you to take away from this is, when we start factoring in river play, and we assume that we have some stacks remaining for the river, then semi-bluffing takes a big boost in expectation and quickly starts becoming better than checking back. Especially the case if you have a nut draw. If you have a nut draw on the turn, the value of building the pot is going to be very, very significant, to the point where it's very unlikely now you would entertain the idea of checking. Let's demonstrate this. So we know that assuming river play, let's say we can generate an expectation of 5.51 big blinds with a check. Let's return now to our original model. You can see in this case we're actually making 5.95 with a bet. So in this case we should definitely be betting. But we want it to be a comparison situation. So let's assume that we can't bet profitably in this situation. How do we do that? By saying that our opponent is just not folding very much. Let's say he's calling the top 80% of his equity. And when we run the EV in this situation, we can see that his expectation, or our expectation of bluffing, is now 2.3 big blinds. So yes, it's profitable, but just to recap, assuming river play, when we check back, we can generate 5.51 big blinds in expectation. So as it stands, we probably shouldn't be bluffing here. But what's the one thing we're missing? We haven't factored in any river play with our semi-bluff, and we know that when we bet 1067 here, we're actually building a pot. So let's see if we can quantify the impact of having a bigger pot on the river when we sometimes hit our flush. We know that if we can generate an expectation of higher than 5.51, we should still definitely be bluffing in this case. So our opponent checks to us again on the river after we bet, and we're obviously going to bet hands where we make a flush. So let's say we're going to bet 2/3 pot. So notice it's now a 25 big blind bet because we spent some time building the pot, and we are going to bet if we have a flush. And let's say our opponent is going to call or fold, but he's going to call with the top 50% of his range. I just like using these numbers because they're simple. Obviously, if you want to try and make more realistic models based on how often players are folding in your games, that's completely fine. Okay, so when we run the EV for that, we can see that we are generating an expectation of 4.24. Now actually, this is still quite not enough for us to be incentivized to semi-bluff the turn. What we can see is the expectation took a significant boost there. It's actually 2 big blinds higher just because we're factoring in river implieds. Now what we should learn from that is that building the pot does have some inherent value. And what we'll typically see is the more our opponent is willing to pay off on the river, the more aggressively, or the less fold equity we need in order for semi-bluffing the turn to still have a higher expectation than checking. So in this case, our opponent's folding about 20% of the time. You can see actually it didn't quite cut it, even if we factor in our river implieds. But let's have a look at the remaining stacks on the river. we can see that there's 81.3 in the remaining stacks. Pot size is 37.33. Now what happens if we decide to modify our bet sizing here and we say that our opponent is capable of paying off? So let's see if we can increase our sizing to pot size. What we can see now is if we get a pot size bet paid off on the river, then the expectation of our turn bluff increases to 5.2. Although of course if our opponent is inclined to pay off big bets, then it's possibly the case that the expectation of checking may go up as well, because maybe he's capable of calling big bets even after the turn gets checked through. Another thing that would greatly increase our expectation is, what if our opponent just doesn't fold on the river ever? So we could just put all hands here and remove his option to fold. Have a look what happens to our expectation in this case. We can see now that it jumps up to 8.04. And remember, it's related to our fold equity as well. So we can see in this case that we should probably still bluff as opposed to check, even if we only get 20% folds. So it's essentially like saying the effective break-even point of our bluff is significantly lower when we have the possibility of a big payout. There is some inherent value with building the pot. And that's why generally you should still bluff, even in position, the spot where checking has a higher expectation. You should still generally bluff even with low amounts of fold equity, because you do have that additional bonus of building the pot. But the truth is, once you start getting below about 20% folds, yes, it will still be profitable. In fact, the interesting thing here is, even if our opponent never folds a turn, let's see what happens. Let's say he has no option to fold the turn now. We're going to delete his folding option. We're going to say that he just calls with all hands in the spot. Have a look at our expectation of this turn semi-bluff in this case. The expectation is still significantly positive, which is kind of interesting. It means that we can actually semi-bluff, and we don't need any fold equity in order for that semi-bluff to be profitable, by virtue of the fact that we're making a bunch of extra money on the river. But the general idea is, unless we are getting more than about 20% folds, we're simply not maximizing our expectation. The amount of folds you need depends on the situation, but we saw, for example, with no river play, that we probably don't want to bluff the turn unless we have more than 30% equity. Now the threshold is going to be lower given river implieds, and in scenarios where you have absolutely insane river implieds because your opponent just can't fold anything, then maybe it's a good idea just to bet the turn anyway, even if you have zero fold equity. But generally speaking, just because something's plus EV, you can see that semi-bluffing with zero equity is plus EV here, which might be something quite difficult to get your head around, because obviously the whole point of semi-bluffing, as we mentioned, was to elicit folds. Yet here we are in a situation where semi-bluffing appears to be plus EV, even though we don't get any folds. But the catch here is that it's not necessarily max EV against an opponent who never folds. There is a threshold where bluffing is still profitable, but you shouldn't bluff because it's not max EV anymore. So don't get too bogged down with the numbers, okay? We've seen a lot of numbers today. The numbers are only going to be accurate if the variables are accurate in this scenario, which is the ranges, how our opponent plays in the river. Those are going to be different against every opponent. So the goal here is not to extrapolate the numbers and say, oh, okay, I know my EV with a check down, assuming 16 big blind pot is 5 big blinds. No, that's not the goal here. The idea is to understand qualitatively which variables impact on our expectation and how. And combining our knowledge, we should be able to establish whether a certain bluff is profitable. It will be helpful if you have some kind of other information, like maybe you will have your opponent's fold to turn c-bet stat there, so you can say, oh, okay, it's above 30% folds, that's probably going to be a profitable bluff, even if I'm all in on the turn, for example. It's going to be a higher EV than a check. It's useful to have that extra information. If not, you can use your population tendencies. But the idea is to have a rough idea of the important variables. You'll know now, for example, that the mere presence of stacks behind after you make your semi-bluff are going to impact on your expected value, which is not something that many players actually realize at all. Let's go to our summary. So firstly, you should be able to understand what a semi-bluff is. And you probably understood what a semi-bluff was before you came to watch this video. I wouldn't be surprised if you understand less what a semi-bluff is now after watching this video. And that's because the more we look at things in detail, the more we realize that linguistic terminology does not do poker plays justice. I mean, for example, we've seen the definition of a semi-bluff is that it's actually a bluff, but we have some pot equity as well when called. But we've just seen a situation where we can profitably semi-bluff when we don't have any fold equity. So what's the word for that in poker? Okay, we can call it a semi-bluff, I guess, but it doesn't really fit to the definition of semi-bluff. That's because the plays we make at the poker table cannot conform well to linguistics. So I don't just want you to understand what a semi-bluff is in terms of telling someone it means it's a bluff with pot equity. I want you to understand a little bit more on the mathematics side now what a semi-bluff is. What are the components that impact on the expectation of a semi-bluff? So an example of these components or these variables, things like position. Perhaps you've never thought about the impact of position on whether you should semi-bluff. There are certain opponents whom you should semi-bluff your flush draws out of position on the turn, but you shouldn't semi-bluff them in position on the turn. It's actually going to be not max EV to do that, whereas it might end up being max EV out of position because there's a lower expectation associated with checking when out of position. It's likely something you haven't thought about. If you have, then great. Make sure you think about it when you are making semi-bluff decisions. Effective stacks. Again, given that the standard model is just to look at a turn shove situation with a draw, then most players don't ever get to the stage where they're thinking about whether the effective stacks have an influence on the expectation. And we've seen, using Card Runner's EV, that the effective stacks do impact on the expectation of our semi-bluff. We've seen that generally the deeper the stacks, the better. The bigger the chance that we get paid off in the river, the likelihood is the more profitable it is to actually semi-bluff the turn, to the point where it might be correct to semi-bluff with 0% fold equity simply because we are increasing the size of the pot and can generate a huge river payout. So there is an inherent value to building the pot. Doesn't always mean it's the right thing to do. Our goal is to take the max EV line. Equity and fold equity, these are the two most basic components of a semi-bluff. The more equity we have, the better. The more fold equity we have, the better. Finally, we can hopefully understand effective break-even points of semi-bluffs. So you saw we're not talking about at what point does our semi-bluff become 0 EV, factoring in our pot equity. We're talking about at what point does our semi-bluff stop being the max EV option relative to checking. This is very, very important. It's often ignored, and frankly, the majority of poker players have probably never even thought about this. Okay, so thanks very much for watching this video. Look forward to catching you in the next part where we're going to talk a little bit more on this issue of linguistics and poker and why using linguistics to analyze poker situations is not that useful. So you'll find out more in the next part of the series. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.